In the heart of ancient Rome, under a blood-red sky, a city trembled beneath the gaze of a man who believed himself a living god. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, was not merely an emperor but a force of chaos, a tyrant whose whims turned the eternal city into a theater of debauchery, bloodshed, and terror. His name evokes images of orgies that scandalized even the libertine Romans, massacres that stained the Forum with innocent blood, and a madness so profound that it shattered the very foundations of imperial dignity. From 37 to 41 AD, over a mere 4 years, Caligula's reign became a dark legend, a cautionary tale of unchecked power and unhinged cruelty. How did a young prince, once hailed as Rome's savior, descend into such infamy? To understand the monster, we must first uncover the man and the world that shaped him. Born on the 31st of August, 12 AD, Gaius was the third child of Germanicus, a celebrated Roman general and nephew of Emperor Tiberius, and Agrippina the Elder, a granddaughter of the great Augustus. His early life was marked by both privilege and peril, spent among soldiers on military campaigns where he earned the affectionate nickname Caligula, meaning little boot, from the miniature military boots he wore as a child. The Roman legions adored him, seeing in the boy a symbol of their beloved Germanicus, whose mysterious death in 19 AD, widely rumored to be poison at Tiberius's order, cast a shadow over the family. Agrippina, fierce and ambitious, never forgave Tiberius, and her open hostility led to her exile along with her 2 eldest sons, leaving young Gaius vulnerable in a court rife with intrigue. Rome in the early 1st century AD was a city of contradictions, a sprawling metropolis of marble temples and squalid slums, where the Senate clung to the illusion of republican power while emperors wielded absolute control. Under Tiberius, who ruled from 14 to 37 AD, the empire was stable but suffocating, marked by paranoia, purges, and a retreat from public life as the aging emperor secluded himself on the island of Capri. The Roman elite whispered of Tiberius's depravities, tales of perverse indulgences that would later pale compared to Caligula's excesses. It was in this atmosphere of decadence and distrust that Gaius came of age, summoned to Capri at the age of 19 to live under Tiberius's watchful eye. Historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio paint a chilling picture of this period, suggesting that Gaius learned cruelty and cunning at the knee of a master, masking his true feelings behind a facade of obedience, while Tiberius's court indulged in vice and violence. Gaius's time on Capri was a crucible, forging a young man who saw power as both a shield and a weapon. He witnessed or perhaps participated in acts of sadism and excess that desensitized him to human suffering. Yet, he was also a survivor, navigating a deadly game of flattery and deception to avoid the fate of his mother and brothers, who had been destroyed by Tiberius's suspicions. When the emperor died in 37 AD, likely hastened by smothering at the hands of Caligula's ally Macro, the head of the Praetorian Guard, Rome rejoiced at the ascension of the 24-year-old Gaius. The people saw in him the promise of a new Augustus, a return to the glory of his great-grandfather's reign. The Senate, weary of Tiberius's gloom, showered him with honors, granting him unprecedented powers in a single decree. Coins were minted bearing his image, and temples echoed with prayers for the young emperor's health. Little did they know that the little boot of their childhood affection would soon stomp upon their hopes with ruthless abandon. The first months of Caligula's reign were deceptively golden. He recalled exiles, including his surviving sisters, and publicly burned Tiberius's secret records of treason trials, declaring an end to fear. He distributed lavish bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and threw grand spectacles for the masses, chariot races, and gladiatorial games that filled the Circus Maximus with cheers. But beneath this benevolence lurked a darkness, a mind already fraying at the edges. Ancient sources hint at early signs of instability, extravagant spending that drained the treasury, an obsession with divine honors, and a cruel streak that emerged in private jests and public punishments. Suetonius recounts how Caligula once forced a senator to kiss his feet, laughing as the man trembled. Was this the playful arrogance of youth, or the first glimpse of a tyrant unbound by morality? As 37 AD drive you to a close, a severe illness struck the emperor, plunging Rome into panic. For weeks, he hovered near death, and the city prayed for his recovery, offering sacrifices and vows of loyalty. When he emerged, gaunt but alive, the people wept with relief, believing their savior had been spared by the gods. But the man who returned was not the same. Some historians speculate that the fever damaged his mind, while others argue the illness merely unmasked a madness long simmering beneath the surface. Whatever the cause, Caligula's transformation was swift and terrifying. He began to see himself not as a mere ruler, but as a deity, demanding worship and reveling in the fear he inspired. The city that had celebrated his ascension would soon become a stage for his depravity, a playground where no life was safe, no boundary sacred. This is where our story truly begins, at the precipice of Caligula's descent into madness, where the promise of a golden reign crumbled into a nightmare of blood and excess. The Rome of 38 AD was a city on edge, unaware that its young emperor would soon turn the forum into a slaughterhouse, the palaces into dens of unspeakable acts, and the very idea of imperial power into a grotesque parody. How did this transformation unfold? And what drove a man to such extremes of cruelty and indulgence? The answers lie in the shadows of his reign, where ambition, paranoia, and unchecked desire collided with catastrophic force. As the year 38 AD dawned over Rome, the city basked in the afterglow of Caligula's initial benevolence, still clinging to the hope that their young emperor would be the savior they so desperately craved. The streets buzzed with the excitement of games and handouts, the air thick with the scent of sacrificial incense offered for the emperor's health after his near-fatal illness. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one that would soon sweep away any illusions of a golden reign. The man who had once charmed the Senate and delighted the masses began to reveal a darker side, a cruelty and capriciousness that sent whispers of unease rippling through the forum. Caligula's mask of sanity was slipping, and Rome would soon feel the weight of his unhinged whims. The first cracks in his facade appeared in his obsession with divine status, a fixation that went beyond the traditional honors bestowed upon emperors. Caligula did not merely accept the flattery of being likened to a god. He demanded it, insisting that temples be erected in his name and that statues of himself replace those of Jupiter and Apollo in sacred spaces. Ancient historian Suetonius recounts how he ordered his own head to be placed on divine effigies, blurring the line between mortal and immortal in a way that shocked even the most sycophantic senators. He began to refer to himself as a living deity, dressing in the silken robes of gods like Mercury or Venus, complete with golden sandals and a laurel crown, parading through the Palatine Hill as if the heavens themselves had descended to earth. To the Roman elite, steeped in tradition, this was not just arrogance but blasphemy, a dangerous affront to the gods who guarded the empire's fate. Yet, it was not only his self-deification that unnerved the city. It was the casual cruelty that accompanied it. Caligula's humor took on a sinister edge, his jests becoming public humiliations for those who dared to cross him or even those who simply caught his eye on a bad day. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot through the dusty streets, their togas flapping as they struggled to keep pace, while he laughed from his gilded seat. At lavish banquets, he would order noblewomen to leave their husbands' sides and join him in private chambers, returning them hours later with smirks and veiled taunts about their honor. Cassius Dio, another key historical source, describes how Caligula delighted in psychological torment, once inviting a senator to dinner only to mockingly accuse him of treason mid-meal, watching the man's face drain of color before dismissing the charge as a joke. These acts were not mere eccentricities. They were calculated displays of power, reminders that no one, not even the highest born, was safe from his whims. The emperor's extravagance also began to drain Rome's coffers at an alarming rate, fueling further discontent. Caligula squandered the treasury on spectacles of unprecedented scale, hosting games where exotic beasts from Africa and Asia were slaughtered by the hundreds for the amusement of the mob. He commissioned golden barges for pleasure cruises on Lake Nemi, floating palaces adorned with marble and mosaics, where he indulged in feasts while musicians played and courtiers fawned. His personal indulgences knew no bounds. Rumors swirled of banquets where dishes were sprinkled with gold dust, of baths filled with perfumed oils so costly that a single dip could bankrupt a province. The Senate, already uneasy with his behavior, watched helplessly as the financial stability Tiberius had painstakingly built crumbled under Caligula's reckless spending. Taxes were raised, properties confiscated, and the emperor even resorted to auctioning off imperial heirlooms to fund his excesses, treating the empire's wealth as his personal plaything. This financial strain was compounded by a growing paranoia that turned Caligula's court into a nest of suspicion and betrayal. The emperor, perhaps haunted by the fate of his own family under Tiberius, saw enemies in every shadow. He began to purge those he deemed disloyal, often on the flimsiest of pretexts. Senators and equestrians who had once hailed his ascension found themselves accused of conspiracy. Their trials, if they were granted one, at a little more than farces orchestrated to justify their execution or exile. Macro, the Praetorian prefect who had helped secure Caligula's throne, was among the first to fall, forced to commit suicide in 38 AD, after the emperor grew suspicious of his influence. Such purges sent a chilling message. Loyalty to Caligula was no guarantee of safety, and even the most trusted allies could be discarded like broken toys. The Roman people, too, began to feel the sting of their emperor's volatility. While the lower classes initially adored him for his generosity, they soon bore the brunt of his erratic policies. Caligula's obsession with grandiose projects, like a plan to build a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae just to ride over it on horseback, diverted resources from grain supplies, leading to shortages that left the plebs hungry and restless. His public spectacles, once a source of joy, took on a macabre tone. He ordered gladiators to fight to the death without reprieve, and criminals were thrown to wild beasts in numbers that turned the arena into a charnel house. The cheers of the crowd began to mix with murmurs of discontent, as even the most bloodthirsty spectators grew weary of endless carnage. By 39 AD, the tension in Rome was palpable, a city holding its breath as Caligula's behavior grew ever more unhinged. His personal life, too, became a source of scandal that shocked even a society accustomed to imperial excess. He openly flaunted incestuous relationships with his sisters, particularly Drusilla, whom he deified after her death in 38 AD, ordering the Senate to worship her as a goddess. His marriages were marked by cruelty and caprice. He divorced and humiliated his wives on a whim, once declaring at a wedding feast that he could have the bride's head if he so desired, before taking her for himself. These acts were not hidden behind palace walls, but performed with brazen audacity, as if daring anyone to challenge his authority. As Caligula's reign entered its third year, the seeds of conflict were well and truly sown. The Senate lived in fear of his next purge. The people grumbled under the weight of his excesses, and the Praetorian Guard, once his staunchest supporters, began to question the stability of the man they protected. Rome, the heart of an empire that spanned continents, was becoming a city of dread, its marble facades hiding a growing rot. The emperor's madness was no longer a whispered rumor, but a stark reality, one that would soon erupt into acts of violence and debauchery so extreme they would sear themselves into history. What would it take for this tension to break? And how far would Caligula push his subjects before they pushed back? By 39 AD, Rome was no longer the city of triumph and order that had once awed the world. It had become a gilded cage, its citizens trapped under the suffocating weight of Caligula's madness. The young emperor, once heralded as a beacon of hope, had morphed into a specter of terror, his every action a twisted parody of imperial power. The Forum, where orators had once debated the fate of nations, now echoed with the screams of the condemned, while the Palatine Hill, seat of emperors, reeked of decadence and despair. Caligula's decline was not a slow unraveling, but a plummeting freefall into a darkness so profound that even the most hardened Romans recoiled in horror. The Eternal City was becoming a stage for his sadistic fantasies, and no one senator, soldier, or slave was spared from his wrath. Caligula's cruelty had evolved from petty humiliations into outright barbarism, a relentless campaign of violence that seemed to feed on itself. He no longer needed reasons to punish. A glance, a rumor, or a mere whim was enough to seal a man's fate. Suetonius recounts chilling tales of senators dragged from their homes in the dead of night, accused of imagined treasons, and executed without trial, their bodies left to rot in the Tiber as a warning to others. One particularly gruesome incident saw Caligula order a father to witness the execution of his own son, forcing the man to smile and thank the emperor for the honor of such a spectacle, lest he join his child in death. The Praetorian Guard, once protectors of the realm, became instruments of terror, carrying out mass arrests and public floggings at the emperor's command, their loyalty bought with gold and fear. The streets of Rome, once alive with commerce and celebration, grew quiet as citizens learned to avoid drawing attention, knowing that a stray word could mean a brutal end. The emperor's obsession with spectacle took on a nightmarish quality, turning the Circus Maximus and the amphitheaters into arenas of unrelenting horror. Caligula delighted in devising new forms of execution for the entertainment of the masses, ordering prisoners to be torn apart by wild beasts while he watched from a golden throne, sipping wine and laughing at their screams. He once commanded that an entire section of the crowd be thrown into the arena as fodder for lions, simply because he found their cheers insufficiently enthusiastic. Cassius Dio describes how he staged mock naval battles on artificial lakes, forcing hundreds of condemned men to fight to the death for his amusement, their blood staining the water crimson under the unrelenting sun. These were not mere games, but orgies of violence, designed to sate Caligula's insatiable appetite for suffering, and to remind Rome that his power was absolute, his mercy non-existent. Yet, it was not only bloodshed that defined Caligula's reign. His debauchery transformed the imperial palaces into dens of unspeakable vice, scandalizing even a city accustomed to excess. Night after night, the halls of the Palatine echoed with the sounds of revelry and depravity, as Caligula hosted banquets that descended into orgies of staggering scale. Senators and their wives were compelled to attend, forced to participate in acts that shattered every boundary of Roman decency, under threat of death if they refused. Suetonius claims the emperor turned the palace into a brothel of sorts, assigning rooms to noblewomen and charging patricians for access, all while he roamed the corridors, selecting partners male or female with predatory glee. His incestuous fixation on his sisters, especially the late Drusilla, became a public obsession. He wept openly for her, demanded divine honors for her memory, and treated her surviving siblings with a possessive cruelty that hinted at dark, unspoken desires. Rome whispered of acts so vile they could not be named, and the elite, once proud guardians of tradition, found themselves degraded beyond recognition. Caligula's madness also manifested in acts of surreal absurdity that bordered on the delusional, further eroding any semblance of rational rule. He famously declared his favorite horse Incitatus, a consul of Rome, decking the animal in purple robes and housing it in a marble stable with ivory fittings, as if to mock the Senate's authority. He ordered soldiers to wage war on the sea itself, commanding them to whip the waves of the English Channel and collect seashells as spoils of victory during a bizarre campaign in Gaul, a stunt that humiliated the legions and baffled his generals. He spoke of moving the capital to Alexandria, dreaming of ruling as a pharaoh god, and even planned to have a statue of himself erected in the Temple of Jerusalem, an act that nearly sparked a revolt among the Jewish population. These were not the actions of a mere eccentric, but of a man whose grip on reality had shattered, leaving Rome at the mercy of his fevered imagination. The toll of this reign of terror was felt at every level of society, as fear became the currency of daily life. Merchants saw their goods confiscated to fund Caligula's whims, while temples were looted to adorn his palaces with gold. The Senate, stripped of any real power, lived in constant dread of the next purge, their sessions reduced to groveling flattery as they hailed the emperor as a god to avoid his wrath. Even the common people, once dazzled by his largesse, now starved under the weight of taxes and grain shortages, their grumbling silenced by the ever-present threat of the Praetorian Guard. Rome was a city in chains, its spirit crushed under the heel of a tyrant who saw his subjects not as people but as playthings, disposable in the pursuit of his twisted pleasures. As 40 AD drive you to a close, the question was no longer whether Caligula's reign could be salvaged, but how much further he could drag Rome into the abyss. His paranoia deepened, his cruelties grew more inventive, and his excesses knew no limit, as if he sought to outdo every horror that had come before. The emperor, who had once been a boy in little boots, now stood as a colossus of terror, casting a shadow over the empire that threatened to consume it entirely. How long could such a reign endure? And what would it take to break the chains of fear that bound the city? The answer lay just beyond the horizon, in a climax of violence and betrayal that would shake the foundations of Rome itself. By the dawn of 41 AD, Rome was a city on the brink of collapse, its marble facades masking a rotting core of fear and desperation. Caligula, the emperor who had once been hailed as a savior, now reigned as a living nightmare, his every decree a lash upon the empire's weary back. The Senate cowered, the people starved, and even the Praetorian Guard, his iron fist of enforcement, began to chafe under the weight of his insanity. 4 years of unrelenting terror had pushed Rome to its breaking point, and whispers of rebellion stirred in the shadows of the Palatine Hill. The stage was set for a reckoning, a violent crescendo that would end the reign of the sadistic tyrant in a storm of blood and betrayal. On the 24th of January, 41 AD, the Eternal City would witness a murder so audacious, so visceral, that it would echo through the annals of history as the fall of a monster. The final months of Caligula's life were marked by an escalation of paranoia that bordered on delirium, as if he sensed the noose tightening around him. He saw conspiracies in every corner, accusing even his closest confidants of plotting his downfall, and his purges grew more frenzied. Senators were slaughtered on mere suspicion, their families exiled or sold into slavery, while courtiers who had once fawned over him now trembled at the mention of his name. Suetonius recounts how Caligula, in a fit of rage, ordered the execution of a loyal advisor simply for coughing during an audience, interpreting the act as a sign of disrespect. His nights were plagued by insomnia, and he roamed the palace corridors, muttering to himself about divine vengeance and enemies unseen, his once charming visage now gaunt and hollow from excess and dread. Yet, even as fear consumed him, his cruelty did not abate. He continued to host depraved banquets and orchestrate public atrocities, as if daring fate to strike him down. The seeds of his doom had been sown long before, in the hearts of men who could no longer endure his tyranny. Among them was Cassius Caria, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, a man of stern military bearing who had served Rome with honor but found himself repeatedly humiliated by Caligula's taunts. The emperor mocked Caria's high-pitched voice, calling him effeminate, and forcing him to endure lewd jests in front of his soldiers, a humiliation that burned deep into the soldier's pride. Chaerea was not alone in his resentment. Other guardsmen, senators, and equestrians, including Cornelius Sabinus and Julius Lupus, joined in secret meetings, their whispers of assassination growing bolder with each passing outrage. They knew the risk failure meant a death more gruesome than any Caligula had yet devised, but the alternative, a life under his boot, was no life at all. The conspiracy coalesced in the shadows, a desperate pact to rid Rome of its tormentor before his madness consumed the empire entirely. The opportunity came during the Palatine Games, a festival held in the 4th of January, 1 AD, to honor the divine Augustus, a cruel irony given Caligula's desecration of his ancestors' legacy. On the morning of the 24th of January, the emperor attended the games in a temporary theater on the Palatine Hill, surrounded by a crowd of spectators and a retinue of guards. He was in high spirits, laughing at the performances and accepting flattery from sycophants, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Chaerea and his co-conspirators had planned meticulously, exploiting their positions within the Praetorian Guard to ensure access to the emperor. As Caligula left the theater at midday to return to the palace for a bath and a meal, passing through a narrow, covered passageway, the trap was sprung. Chaerea approached under the guise of delivering a routine report, his face a mask of deference, while his fellow plotters positioned themselves nearby, hands on hidden daggers. What followed was a frenzy of violence, a release of years of pent-up rage and terror. Chaerea struck the first blow, driving his sword into Caligula's neck with such force that the emperor staggered, blood spraying across the stone floor. Before he could cry out for help, Sabinus and others descended upon him, their blades flashing in the dim light of the corridor. Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe a scene of savage brutality. Caligula was stabbed over 30 times, his body torn apart by the fury of men who had endured too much. He fell to the ground, his golden robe soaked crimson, gasping out curses or pleasaccounts differ before a final thrust to his chest silenced him forever. The tyrant who had styled himself a god died as a mortal, his blood pooling beneath him, a stark reminder of the fragility he had so long denied. But the conspirators' wrath did not end with Caligula. In a blind rage, they hunted down his wife, Melonia Caesonia, and their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, smashing the child's head against a wall and murdering the empress in a brutal echo of the emperor's own cruelty. The immediate aftermath was chaos, as news of the assassination spread like wildfire through the city. The Praetorian Guard, loyal to Caligula, or simply fearing for their own necks, clashed with the conspirators, while senators and citizens alike reeled in shock and uncertainty. Some cheered the death of the monster, tearing down his statues and defacing his image, while others feared retribution or the collapse of order itself. Caligula's body was hastily cremated on a makeshift pyre in the Lamian Gardens, his ashes later interred with little ceremony, a far cry from the divine honors he had demanded in life. The man who had turned Rome into a city of orgies, massacres, and terror was gone, his reign of madness extinguished in a single bloody moment. But the wounds he had inflicted on the empire ran deep, and the question remained, could Rome heal from the nightmare of Caligula, or had his darkness stained its soul forever? The air of Rome on the 24th of January, 41 AD, was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sharp edge of uncertainty. Caligula, the emperor who had turned the eternal city into a crucible of terror and debauchery, lay dead, his body reduced to a mangled heap in a palace corridor, struck down by the very guards sworn to protect him. The news of his assassination rippled through the city like a shockwave, shattering the oppressive silence that had gripped Rome for 4 long years. In the Forum, citizens gathered in hushed clusters, torn between relief and dread, while on the Palatine Hill, the Senate and Praetorian Guard scrambled to make sense of a world without their tyrant. The monster was gone, but his shadow lingered, a dark stain on the empire's heart. What would become of Rome now that the chains of Caligula's madness had been broken, or had they merely been exchanged for new ones? In the immediate hours following the assassination, chaos reigned supreme. The Praetorian Guard, some still loyal to Caligula or fearing for their own positions, clashed with the conspirators led by Cassius Caria, their swords ringing through the marble halls as blood continued to spill. Senators, long cowed into submission, emerged from hiding, some hailing the murder as liberation while others whispered of retribution from Caligula's remaining allies. The common people, weary from years of oppression, reacted with a mix of jubilation and fear. Statues of the fallen emperor were toppled in the streets, his name cursed in taverns, yet many wondered if this act of violence would plunge Rome into civil war. Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe a city teetering on the edge, its order fraying as rival factions vied for control in the sudden vacuum of power. The brutal murders of Caligula's wife, Melonia Caesonia, and their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, by the conspirators only deepened the sense of lawlessness, a grim reminder that the savagery of the emperor's reign had infected even those who sought to end it. Amid this turmoil, an unlikely figure emerged from the shadows to claim the imperial throne. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, a man long dismissed as a stammering, physically frail outcast of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Hidden in the palace during the assassination, trembling behind a curtain, as the conspirators hunted for remnants of Caligula's line, Claudius was discovered by a Praetorian soldier not to be killed, but to be hailed as emperor. The guard, recognizing the need for a figurehead to restore stability and secure their own influence, dragged the reluctant Claudius before their ranks and proclaimed him ruler, a decision later ratified by a shell-shocked Senate. Claudius, at 50 years old, was an improbable choice, mocked for his limp and speech impediment, yet his survival through years of imperial purges spoke to a quiet cunning. His ascension marked the end of the immediate crisis, but not the end of Rome's troubles. Many doubted his ability to govern, and whispers of republican restoration or rival claimants lingered in the air. Claudius's first acts as emperor were calculated to distance himself from Caligula's legacy and to heal a fractured city. He ordered the conspirators, including Chaerea, to be executed not out of vengeance for Caligula, but to assert control and prevent further assassinations from becoming a precedent. He publicly condemned his nephew's reign, banning the mention of Caligula's name in official records and rescinding the divine honors the tyrant had demanded. Temples defaced by Caligula's image were restored, and efforts were made to replenish the treasury, bled dry by years of extravagance, through cautious reforms and the reversal of punitive taxes. Yet, the scars of Caligula's rule ran deeper than policy could mend. The Senate, though relieved, remained wary of imperial power, their trust in the Principate shattered by a ruler who had treated them as playthings. The people, too, bore the weight of trauma, their faith in the gods and the state shaken by a reign that had turned bread and circuses into starvation and slaughter. The physical remnants of Caligula's excesses were dismantled wherever possible, a symbolic purging of his memory. His ostentatious projects, like the golden barges on Lake Nemi, were abandoned or stripped for resources, while his statues were melted down or buried, as if to erase his visage from history. But some traces could not be so easily removed. The stories of his orgies and massacres lived on in hushed tales, passed from generation to generation, a dark folklore that painted him as less a man and more a demon. Claudius, aware of the lingering poison of Caligula's name, sought to redirect Rome's gaze towards stability and conquest, launching campaigns in Britain to restore imperial glory and distract from the horrors of the recent past. Yet, even as legions marched and aqueducts rose, the specter of Caligula haunted the Palatine, a reminder of how quickly power could corrupt, how deeply madness could wound. Beyond the political sphere, the social fabric of Rome bore lasting damage from Caligula's reign. The nobility, humiliated and decimated by purges, struggled to reclaim their dignity, while families torn apart by exile or execution mourned in silence, their grief a private rebellion against the state that had failed them. The Praetorian Guard, instrumental in both Caligula's rise and fall, emerged with newfound influence, their role in crowning Claudius cementing their power as King Macursa a dangerous precedent for future emperors. Among the masses, cynicism took root. The divine aura of the emperor, so carefully cultivated by Augustus, had been shattered by a ruler who claimed godhood only to die in a pool of his own blood. Faith in the system wavered, and though Claudius's reign brought a measure of calm, the memory of Caligula's terror sowed seeds of doubt that would fester in the empire's underbelly for decades to come. As the dust settled over Rome in the months following the assassination, a fragile peace descended, but it was a peace built on the ruins of trust and innocence. The city that had endured Caligula's madness was not the same one that had cheered his ascension. It was a Rome hardened by suffering, wary of its rulers, and forever marked by the memory of a tyrant whose cruelty knew no bounds. The question lingered in the minds of senators and citizens alike. Could the empire truly recover, or had Caligula's reign exposed a fatal flaw in the very nature of imperial power? The answer would unfold in the years ahead, but for now, Rome stood at a crossroads, its future as uncertain as the blood-soaked stones of the Palatine. In the years following Caligula's brutal assassination on the 24th of January, 41 AD, Rome struggled to rebuild from the wreckage of his 4-year reign, a period so steeped in terror and excess that it seemed more myth than history. Under Claudius, the empire sought to bury the memory of the sadistic tyrant, erasing his name from official chronicles and melting down his statues as if to purge his very existence from the eternal city. Yet, Caligula's shadow proved impossible to escape. His story endured not in marble or edict, but in the whispered horrors passed down through generations, a cautionary tale of power unchecked and madness unleashed. His legacy became a scar on the soul of Rome, a dark mirror reflecting the fragility of imperial rule and the depths to which a single man could drag an empire. How has history remembered or chosen to forget this emperor whose cruelty turned a city of glory into one of orgies, massacres, and terror? In the immediate aftermath, Claudius and the Senate worked tirelessly to distance the Julio-Claudian dynasty from Caligula's infamy. His acts of deification were revoked, his divine statues replaced with those of traditional gods, and his name was struck from public records in a process known as damnatio memoriae, deliberate attempt to erase a disgraced figure from history. Temples he had desecrated were reconsecrated, and his grandiose projects, like the opulent barges on Lake Nemi, were left to decay or repurposed for more practical ends. Claudius, aware of the stain on his family's name, focused on restoring stability through military conquests and infrastructure, hoping to overshadow Caligula's reign with achievements like the invasion of Britain. Yet, even as official narratives painted Claudius as Rome's savior, the people could not forget. In taverns and tenements, they spoke of the emperor who had styled himself a god only to die in a pool of blood, of banquets that turned to orgies, and of arenas soaked in the gore of the innocent. These stories, though suppressed by the state, became folklore, a grim reminder of the monster who had once ruled them. Ancient historians, writing in the decades and centuries that followed, ensured that Caligula's name would not vanish entirely, though their accounts often blurred the line between fact and sensationalism. Suetonius, in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, and Cassius Dio, in his Roman History, chronicled Caligula's reign with a mix of horror and fascination, detailing his cruelties, debaucheries, and absurdities, such as appointing his horse Incitatus as consul, with a tone that sometimes veered into exaggeration. Their works, written under later emperors like Nero and the Flavians, served both as historical record and moral warning, portraying Caligula as the epitome of tyranny a man whose madness exposed the dangers of absolute power. Tacitus, another key historian, lamented the loss of detailed records from Caligula's time, much of which was destroyed or suppressed, leaving gaps in our understanding of his rule. Yet, even these fragmented accounts cemented Caligula's reputation as a symbol of depravity, a ruler whose excesses made even the worst of his successors seem tame by comparison. Over the centuries, Caligula's legacy evolved, shaped by the lens of each era that revisited his story. In the Middle Ages, Christian writers seized upon his reign as evidence of pagan decadence, casting him as a precursor to the Antichrist, a godless tyrant whose blasphemies invited divine wrath. During the Renaissance, his name became synonymous with unchecked hedonism, inspiring lurid artworks and dramas that exaggerated his orgies and cruelties for shock value. In modern times, scholars have debated the accuracy of ancient sources, questioning whether Caligula's madness was genuine mental illness, perhaps exacerbated by his near-fatal fever in 37 AD, a product of political propaganda by enemies who sought to justify his assassination. Some argue that his actions, while brutal, were not entirely unprecedented in a Rome already steeped in violence and excess. Others see him as a uniquely destructive force, a ruler whose personal pathologies amplified the flaws of the imperial system. Regardless of interpretation, Caligula remains a cultural touchstone, his name invoked as shorthand for tyranny and insanity. From historical texts to popular media like films and novels that dramatize his reign with equal parts horror and intrigue. The impact of Caligula's rule on the Roman Empire itself was profound, though often subtle in its long-term effects. His reign exposed the fragility of the Principate, the system of imperial rule established by Augustus, revealing how a single deranged emperor could destabilize an empire built on the illusion of divine mandate. The Senate, humiliated and decimated under his purges, never fully recovered its influence, paving the way for future emperors to wield even greater autocratic power. The Praetorian Guard, emboldened by their role in both Caligula's rise and fall, became a permanent fixture in imperial politics, their loyalty, a commodity to be bought rather than assume it a trend that would lead to further instability in the centuries ahead. Perhaps most enduringly, Caligula's reign sowed seeds of cynicism among the Roman people. The divine aura of the emperor, so carefully crafted by earlier rulers, was tarnished, replaced by a wariness that lingered through the reigns of Nero, Domitian, and beyond, until the empire's eventual fall. As we reflect on Caligula's story, we are left with a haunting question. What does his reign reveal about the nature of power and the human capacity for cruelty? Was he a singular aberration, a madman whose actions defy explanation, or a product of a system that granted one man the ability to indulge every dark impulse without restraint? His life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about authority, about how thin the veneer of civilization can be when power is absolute and accountability is absent. Rome survived Caligula, but at a cost, carrying forward the wounds of his terror as a reminder of what can happen when a city, an empire, or a people surrenders to the whims of a tyrant. Perhaps his true legacy is not in the blood he spilled or the depravities he orchestrated, but in the warning he left behind, a warning that echoes even now, nearly 2 millennia later, urging us to guard against the monsters that power can create. If this story has stirred something in you, whether horror, fascination, or a desire to understand the depths of history, let's keep the conversation alive. What do you think drove Caligula to such extremes? And could such a reign happen again in a different form? Share your thoughts, questions, or reflections in the comments below, and let's explore the shadows of the past together.